He smiled too wide when I mentioned the estate. My name is Benjamin. I am 61 years old and I spent the last 35 years building a commercial property management company in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I own 17 properties scattered across the city, most of them leased to medical offices, dental clinics, and small retail shops. The business brought in steady income, enough to live comfortably and put money aside for my daughter and grandkids. I never married again after my wife died 12 years ago. My daughter, Audrey, was all I had left. That afternoon at the restaurant, I gathered everyone together to talk about the future. Audrey sat beside her husband, Trevor. My two grandchildren, Jacob and Mia, were at the table too, both young adults now. Jacob was 23 and finishing a business degree. Mia was 20 and studying graphic design. I wanted them to understand what I planned to leave behind, how the properties would be distributed, and what role each of them might play in managing things when I was gone. Trevor leaned forward when I started talking. His eyes lit up in a way that made my stomach tighten. He nodded along as I explained the portfolio, asked questions about revenue streams, and smiled that broad, eager smile. It was the kind of smile that lingered too long, the kind that said he was already counting something that was not his yet. I had known Trevor for 8 years, ever since Audrey brought him home for Thanksgiving. He worked in sales for a pharmaceutical company, did well enough to afford a decent house and 2 cars. He treated Audrey fine, or so it seemed. He played the role of a good son-in-law, always polite, always asking how I was doing, always offering to help with small tasks around my place. But there was something underneath it all, a hunger I could not name at first. I noticed it in the way he talked about money, about success, about people who had made it big. He admired wealth more than the work it took to build it. That lunch was supposed to be simple. I wanted to lay everything out clearly so there would be no confusion later. I told them I planned to leave the business to Audrey, with Jacob and Mia inheriting equal shares when she passed. I wanted them to know the properties were secure, that the tenants were reliable, and that the income would support them for years. I even mentioned setting aside a trust for the grandkids, something they could access when they turned 30. Trevor listened closely, nodding at every word. When I paused to take a sip of water, he jumped in with a suggestion. He said it might make sense to liquidate a few properties soon, before the market shifted. He talked about maximizing value, about diversifying into stocks or bonds, about how holding real estate long-term was risky. His tone was helpful, almost paternal, as if he were guiding me toward a smarter decision. I set my glass down and looked at him. I did not argue. I just said I would think about it. But something in his expression bothered me. He was too invested in the conversation, too eager to shape the plan. Audrey glanced between us, sensing the tension but saying nothing. Jacob and Mia stayed quiet, focused on their food. The waiter came by to refill our drinks. He was young, maybe mid-20s, with dark hair and a quiet demeanor. He moved efficiently, pouring water into each glass without making a fuss. When he reached my side, he leaned in slightly, close enough that only I could hear. His voice was low, barely above a whisper. "Check your water." I froze. My hand hovered over the glass. I looked up at him, but he had already moved on, heading toward the kitchen without another glance. I stared at my drink, then at Trevor, who was still talking about market trends and investment strategies. Audrey laughed at something he said, but I could not focus on her words. My pulse quickened. I set the glass down and pushed it slightly away from me. No one noticed. Trevor kept talking, gesturing with his hands. Jacob asked a question about property taxes, and I answered it automatically, my mind elsewhere. I watched Trevor closely, studying the way he glanced at my glass, the way his smile never quite reached his eyes. I told myself I was imagining things, that the waiter's comment meant nothing, but I could not shake the unease crawling up my spine. I excused myself to use the restroom. On the way, I flagged down the waiter in the hallway near the kitchen. He glanced around, making sure no one was watching, then gestured for me to follow him into a side corridor away from the dining area. "What did you mean?" I asked, keeping my voice low. He hesitated, then pulled out his phone. He showed me a photo, grainy and taken from a distance. It was Trevor standing near the bar before we sat down. He was holding something small, a vial or a packet, tucked in his palm. The angle made it hard to see clearly, but the motion was deliberate. He had been near my drink. "I work here part-time," the waiter said. "I am also a student. I saw him mess with your glass when no one was looking. I do not know what it was, but I thought you should know." I stared at the photo, my chest tightening. I asked if he was sure. He nodded. "I switched the drinks when I refilled them," he added. "Yours is on the other side now. His is where yours was." I thanked him, my voice barely steady. He told me to be careful and slipped back toward the kitchen. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what I had just heard. Trevor had done something to my drink. I did not know what, but the intent was clear. He wanted me out of the way. I walked back to the table, my mind racing. Trevor was laughing at something Jacob said, his hand resting casually on the table. I sat down and picked up the glass in front of me, the one the waiter had said was safe. I took a slow sip, watching Trevor over the rim. He did not look my way. He seemed relaxed, confident, as if everything was going according to plan. I set the glass down and leaned back in my chair. I did not say anything. I just listened as the conversation continued, my thoughts already spinning ahead. I had trusted Trevor. I had welcomed him into my family, treated him like a son, and now I knew the truth. He was not waiting for me to die. He was planning to make it happen. Trevor came into our lives 8 years ago in November, right before Thanksgiving. Audrey had been single for a while, focused on her career as a nurse. She worked long shifts at a hospital downtown, often coming home exhausted but content. When she mentioned she was seeing someone, I was happy for her. She deserved companionship, someone to share her life with. Trevor seemed like a good match at first. He was polite, clean-cut, and had a steady job. He brought wine when he visited, asked about my health, and offered to help with yard work or small repairs around my house. He talked about his career with confidence, about hitting sales targets and earning bonuses. He seemed ambitious, driven, but not in a way that raised alarms. I thought he was building a future for himself and Audrey. They married 2 years after they started dating. The wedding was small, held at a venue on the edge of town with close family and a few friends. Trevor seemed happy that day, smiling in every photo, his arm around Audrey as they danced. I gave a toast, welcoming him into the family, telling him I was glad Audrey had found someone solid. He shook my hand afterward, thanked me, and said he would take care of her. I believed him. The first few years were fine. They bought a house, settled into routines, and spent holidays with me and the grandkids. Trevor was always present, always engaged, but there was a shift over time, subtle but noticeable. He started asking more questions about my business. At first, it seemed like genuine curiosity, a son-in-law wanting to understand what his father-in-law had built. But the questions grew more pointed. He asked about property values, about rental income, about what would happen to the business when I retired or passed away. I answered him at first, thinking it was harmless. I explained how I managed the properties, how I handled tenant issues, how I kept the business profitable. He listened closely, taking mental notes, occasionally offering suggestions. He talked about efficiency, about scaling, about leveraging equity. His language was corporate, polished, the kind of talk you hear from someone who has read too many business books, but never built anything himself. Audrey did not seem to notice the shift. She was busy with work and the kids, juggling schedules and responsibilities. When Trevor brought up the business at family dinners, she smiled and nodded, proud that her husband was taking an interest in her father's work. She did not see what I was starting to see, that his interest was not about learning or helping, it was about positioning himself. The red flags started appearing about 3 years ago. Trevor began making comments about my age, about how managing properties must be tiring, about how I should think about stepping back and letting someone younger take over. He framed it as concern, as if he were looking out for my well-being. But I caught the undertone. He wanted control. I brushed it off at first. I told myself he was just trying to be helpful, that he meant well. But then I noticed other things. He started showing up at my office unannounced, claiming he was in the area and thought he would stop by. He asked to see tenant contracts, lease agreements, financial records. I let him look at a few documents, thinking transparency would ease whatever anxiety he had about the future. But instead, it seemed to fuel something darker. He began talking to Audrey about the business more often. I knew because she mentioned it to me casually over coffee one afternoon. She said Trevor thought the properties were undervalued, that I should consider selling a few and reinvesting the money elsewhere. She said he had ideas, strategies, plans. I nodded and told her I would think about it, but inside, I felt a knot forming. Trevor was planting seeds, trying to influence decisions that were not his to make. Jacob and Mia were closer to me than to Trevor. They visited often, helped me with small tasks, and asked about the business out of genuine interest. Jacob talked about eventually working with me after he graduated, about learning the trade and carrying on what I had built. Mia was less interested in the business side, but she loved the properties, especially the older buildings with character. She talked about renovating spaces, about turning them into something artistic. I encouraged both of them, told them the business would be theirs one day, that they could shape it however they wanted. Trevor did not like that. He never said it outright, but I could see it in the way he reacted when Jacob or Mia talked about the future. He would shift in his seat, change the subject, or make a comment about how complicated property management was, how it required experience and expertise. He was trying to undermine their confidence, to position himself as the only one capable of handling things when I was gone. I started keeping my distance from him after that. I still invited the family over, still made time for the grandkids, but I stopped sharing details about the business. When Trevor asked questions, I gave vague answers. When he offered advice, I thanked him and moved on. He noticed the shift. I saw it in the way he looked at me, the way his smile tightened when I did not engage. Audrey asked me once if something was wrong between Trevor and me. I told her everything was fine, that I was just tired, that managing the properties took more energy than it used to. She believed me. Or maybe she wanted to believe me. Either way, she did not press further. But I knew something had changed. Trevor was not just waiting for me to die. He was impatient. He wanted the business, the income, the control, and he wanted it now. I saw it in the way he talked, in the way he maneuvered conversations, in the way he smiled too wide whenever I mentioned the estate. That lunch was supposed to be a straightforward discussion about the future. I wanted to make sure everyone understood the plan, that there would be no confusion or conflict when I was gone. But Trevor's reaction told me everything I needed to know. He was not interested in the plan. He was interested in accelerating it. And now, sitting at that table, knowing what he had tried to do, I realized just how far he was willing to go. I kept my expression neutral as the meal continued. Trevor was laughing, telling a story about a client meeting that had gone sideways. Audrey smiled beside him, her hand resting on his arm. Jacob and Mia listened politely, occasionally glancing at their phones. Everything looked normal. But I could not stop thinking about the waiter's words, about the photo on his phone, about the glass Trevor had tampered with. I watched him closely, studying every movement. He reached for his water glass, the one that was now sitting where mine had been. He lifted it to his lips and took a long drink. I felt my pulse quicken. If the waiter was right, if the drinks had been switched, then whatever Trevor had put in my glass was now in his. Nothing happened at first. He set the glass down and continued talking. I forced myself to breathe evenly, to keep my face relaxed. Audrey asked me a question about one of the properties, something about a tenant dispute I had resolved last month. I answered her, my voice steady, though my mind was racing. Trevor took another sip, then another. His smile remained fixed, his tone animated. But after a few minutes, I noticed a change. His words slowed slightly, his gestures became less precise. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and leaned back in his chair. Audrey glanced at him, concern flickering across her face. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," he said, his voice thick. "Just tired. Long week." He reached for his water again, drained the glass. The waiter appeared almost immediately, refilling it without a word. Trevor drank more, as if trying to clear whatever fog was settling over him. I watched, my chest tight. I did not know what he had used, but whatever it was working. He excused himself to use the restroom, standing slowly, gripping the edge of the table for balance. Audrey watched him go, her brow furrowed. Jacob asked if I thought he was okay, and I said he probably just needed some air. Inside, I was calculating. If Trevor had tried to drug me, then he had planned this carefully. He had brought something to the restaurant, slipped it into my drink when no one was looking, and expected me to collapse or become disoriented. Maybe he planned to call an ambulance to make it look like a heart attack or a stroke. Maybe he wanted me declared unfit, unable to manage my affairs, so he could step in and take control. But now, the plan had backfired. He was the one feeling the effects, and I was the only one who knew why. Trevor returned a few minutes later, his face pale. He sat down heavily, his movements sluggish. Audrey reached over, placing a hand on his forehead. "You feel warm," she said. "Maybe we should go." "I'm fine," he insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "Just need to sit for a minute." I leaned forward, my tone calm. "You do not look fine. Maybe Audrey is right. You should get some rest." He looked at me, his eyes unfocused. For a moment, I saw something flicker in his expression, a shadow of realization, as if some part of him understood what had happened. But he said nothing. He just nodded, his jaw tight. Audrey gathered her things, apologizing to me and the kids. She said they would head home, that Trevor probably just needed to lie down. I stood walking them to the door. Trevor leaned on Audrey as they left, his steps unsteady. I watched them go, my face blank, my thoughts sharp. Jacob and Mia stayed behind, finishing their meals. They asked if I thought Trevor was okay, and I said he would be fine, that it was probably just exhaustion. They accepted the explanation and moved on to other topics. I listened, nodding at the right moments, but my mind was elsewhere. I knew what Trevor had tried to do, and now I knew how far I needed to go to stop him. After the meal, I drove home and sat in my living room, staring at the wall. The house was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I thought about Audrey, about how she would react if she knew the truth. I thought about Jacob and Mia, about how they looked up to me, how they trusted me to leave them something stable. I thought about Trevor, about the way he had smiled that afternoon, about how he had looked at my glass with cold calculation. I could not let him get away with it, but I also could not expose him without proof, without a plan. If I accused him outright, he would deny it. He would twist the story, make me look paranoid or unstable. He would turn Audrey against me, convince her that I was losing my mind. I needed to be smarter than that. I needed to move carefully. I pulled out my phone and called the waiter. He answered after a few rings, his voice cautious. I thanked him again for what he had done, for switching the drinks, for trusting his instincts. I asked if he still had the photo. He said he did. I told him to keep it safe, that I might need it later. He agreed, and we ended the call. Then I started planning. I went through my files, reviewing every document related to the business, every lease agreement, every financial record. I made copies of everything, stored them in multiple locations. I updated my will, making sure it was clear that Audrey inherited the business, with Jacob and Mia as secondary beneficiaries. I added a clause stating that if Audrey predeceased me, or if she was deemed unfit to manage the estate, the properties would go directly to the grandkids. I made sure Trevor's name appeared nowhere in the documents. I also reached out to my lawyer, a man I had worked with for over 20 years. I told him I needed to review the estate plan, that I wanted to make sure everything was airtight. He agreed to meet with me the following week. I did not tell him why, not yet. I needed more information first, more evidence. Over the next few days, I watched Trevor closely. I called Audrey to check on him, asking how he was feeling. She said he had been sick for a couple of days, that whatever hit him at the restaurant had lingered. He stayed home from work, spent most of his time in bed. She sounded worried, but not suspicious. She had no idea what had really happened. I knew Trevor would recover. Whatever he had used was not strong enough to cause permanent damage, but it had been enough to show me his intent. He had tried to harm me, to remove me from the picture. And now, I had to make sure he paid for it. I sat in my office that night, the lights off, the city quiet outside my window. I thought about the years I had spent building the business, the sacrifices I had made, the trust I had placed in the people around me. Trevor had taken that trust and twisted it into something ugly. He had looked at me and seen nothing but an obstacle, something to be removed. But he had made a mistake. He had underestimated me. And now I was going to make sure he understood the cost of that mistake. Trevor recovered within a week. Audrey called to tell me he was back at work, that whatever had made him sick seemed to have passed. She sounded relieved, and I told her I was glad to hear it. I kept my tone light, casual, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I started digging into Trevor's background, something I should have done years ago. I hired a private investigator, a woman named Valerie, who specialized in financial fraud and personal misconduct. I told her I needed to know everything about Trevor, his work history, his finances, his associates, his connections, his debts, his past business dealings. She asked why, and I said it was a family matter. She did not press further. She told me it would take a few weeks to compile a thorough report. Valerie came back with a report 3 weeks later. She met me at a coffee shop downtown, handing me a thick folder across the table. I opened it and started reading. What I found made my stomach turn. Trevor had debts, significant debts. He owed money to creditors, some of them legitimate, others less so. He had maxed out several credit cards, taken out personal loans, and fallen behind on payments. His salary from the pharmaceutical company was decent, but not enough to cover his lifestyle. He and Audrey lived in a house they could barely afford, drove cars that were leased, not owned, and carried a mortgage that stretched their budget to the breaking point. The numbers painted a picture of desperation, of someone living beyond their means and scrambling to keep up appearances. Valerie had also uncovered something else. Trevor had been involved in a business venture 5 years ago, before he married Audrey. He had partnered with a colleague to start a consulting firm, promising investors high returns on a healthcare technology project. The firm collapsed within 18 months, taking investor money with it. Trevor walked away before any lawsuits were filed, but the colleague was not as lucky. He faced legal action, lost his savings, and declared bankruptcy. Trevor had escaped by distancing himself at the right moment, leaving his partner to take the fall. The pattern was clear. He had done this before. I closed the folder and looked at Valerie. She watched me carefully, her expression neutral. I asked if there was anything else. She hesitated, then told me there were rumors. People who had worked with Trevor described him as charming but opportunistic, someone who knew how to talk his way into situations and out of consequences. One former coworker said Trevor had a habit of targeting people with money, building relationships with them, and then finding ways to benefit financially. Another mentioned that Trevor had borrowed money from colleagues and never paid it back, always with an excuse, always with a promise to make things right. I thanked Valerie and paid her. She told me to be careful, that men like Trevor did not take kindly to being cornered. I nodded and left the coffee shop, the folder tucked under my arm. That night I sat in my office and read through the report again, absorbing every detail. Trevor had been playing a long game, positioning himself as the devoted son-in-law while planning to take everything I had built. He had married Audrey not because he loved her, but because she was my daughter, because she was his pathway to the estate. And now that I knew the truth, I understood why he had tried to drug me. He needed me gone so he could push Audrey into liquidating the properties, paying off his debts and securing his future. He had no intention of managing the business or preserving what I had built. He wanted cash, immediate access to funds that would solve his problems and give him the lifestyle he craved. I thought about confronting him, about laying out everything I had learned and demanding he leave the family. But that would not work. Trevor was a talker, a manipulator. He would twist the story, convince Audrey I was overreacting, that the investigator had gotten things wrong. that I was a bitter old man trying to drive a wedge between him and his wife. He would paint himself as the victim, and I would look like the aggressor. Audrey might even take his side, believing his charm over my accusations. No, I needed a different approach. I needed to expose him in a way that left no room for doubt, no opportunity for him to spin the narrative. I needed to make him show his true self, not just to me, but to Audrey, to the grandkids, to everyone who mattered. I started by cutting off his access to information about the business. I stopped mentioning the properties around him, stopped answering his questions, stopped engaging with his suggestions. When he asked about my plans, I told him they were still in progress, that I was working with my lawyer to finalize things. He nodded, but I could see the frustration in his eyes. He wanted details, wanted to know where things stood, wanted to understand how close he was to getting what he believed was coming to him. But I gave him nothing. Then I set a trap. I called Audrey and told her I wanted to have another family meeting, this time at my office. I said I had finalized the estate plan and wanted to go over it with everyone. She agreed, saying she would bring Trevor and the kids. I told her to come on a Saturday afternoon, when the building would be mostly empty. I prepared carefully. I set up a recording device in the conference room, hidden where no one would notice. I arranged for my lawyer to be present, along with Valerie, who I introduced as a consultant helping with the estate. I wanted witnesses, people who could verify what happened, people whose testimony would carry weight if things escalated. Trevor arrived with Audrey, Jacob, and Mia. He looked relaxed, confident, as if he already knew what I was going to say. We gathered around the conference table, and I started by thanking everyone for coming. I said I wanted to make sure the estate plan was clear, that everyone understood their roles and responsibilities moving forward. Trevor leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. He asked if I had considered his suggestion about liquidating some properties. I looked at him, my expression blank, and said I had. He smiled, waiting for me to continue. Instead, I turned to my lawyer and asked him to explain the plan. My lawyer opened a folder and began outlining the details. The business would go to Audrey, with Jacob and Mia as co-beneficiaries. The properties would remain intact, managed as a portfolio, with income distributed according to a trust structure. There would be no liquidation, no sale of assets, no immediate cash payout. The plan was designed to preserve wealth, not convert it. Trevor's smile faded. He interrupted, asking if I had thought about the risks of holding onto the properties long term. He talked about market volatility, about the challenges of property management, about how liquidating would give the family more flexibility, more options, more security. His tone was insistent, almost aggressive. He was pushing hard, harder than he should have been, and I could see the desperation creeping into his voice. I let him talk. Then I asked him why he was so focused on liquidation. He hesitated, glancing at Audrey. She looked confused, unsure where the conversation was going. I pressed further, asking if he had debts, if he needed money, if there was something he was not telling us. His face went rigid. The room fell silent. "That is not what this is about," he said, his voice tight. I nodded slowly. Then I told him I knew about the debts. I knew about the credit cards, the loans, the failed business venture, the colleague he had abandoned. I knew about the investor who lost everything because of him, about the pattern of manipulation and opportunism that followed him wherever he went. I said it calmly, without anger, just stating facts. The room went silent. Audrey stared at Trevor, her eyes wide. Jacob and Mia looked between us, unsure what to say. Trevor's face flushed, his jaw clenched. His carefully constructed facade was crumbling. "You had me investigated?" he said, his voice rising. "I did," I replied, "because I needed to understand why you tried to drug me." Audrey gasped. Trevor stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He denied it, said I was lying, that I was trying to turn the family against him, that this was some kind of twisted attempt to control everyone. His voice was loud, defensive, and I could see panic flashing in his eyes. I reached into my folder and pulled out the photo the waiter had taken. I slid it across the table. Trevor stared at it, his face pale, "That is you," I said, "at the restaurant with something in your hand, near my drink." He opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at Audrey, but she was staring at the photo, her expression horrified. Jacob leaned over to see, his face hardening. Mia covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes filling with tears. "You switched the drinks," Trevor said quietly, his voice barely audible. "You knew." I nodded. "The waiter helped me. You drank what was meant for me." Trevor collapsed back into his chair, his head in his hands. Audrey stood, her voice shaking. "What did you do, Trevor? What did you try to give him?" He did not answer. He just sat there, his shoulders slumped, his breathing heavy. My lawyer spoke up, saying that if Trevor wanted to avoid legal consequences, he needed to leave. He needed to divorce Audrey, disappear from our lives, and never come back. Otherwise, the photo and the investigator's report would go to the police and he would face criminal charges for attempted poisoning. Trevor looked up, his eyes red. He glanced around the room, at Audrey's tear-streaked face, at Jacob's clenched fists, at Mia's devastated expression. He seemed to understand that there was no way out, no argument he could make, no lie he could tell that would save him. "I was desperate," he said finally, his voice cracking. "The debts were crushing me. I thought if I could just get access to the estate, I could fix everything. I never meant to hurt anyone." I stared at him, my expression cold. "You meant to hurt me. You planned it. You brought a drug to a family lunch and tried to poison me so you could steal what I have spent my entire life building." Trevor said nothing. He just looked down at his hands, defeated. Audrey turned away from him, her whole body shaking. Jacob put an arm around her, and Mia moved closer, the three of them forming a barrier between Trevor and the rest of the family. I told Trevor to leave. He stood slowly, his movements unsteady, and walked out of the conference room without looking back. The door closed behind him, and the silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Audrey broke down, sobbing into Jacob's shoulder. Mia reached for my hand, squeezing it tightly. My lawyer and Valerie exchanged glances but said nothing. I sat there, watching my family process the betrayal, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. Relief that the truth was finally out, that Trevor could no longer threaten us. Sadness that Audrey had to go through this, that the man she had trusted and loved had turned out to be someone so completely different from who she thought he was. The days after Trevor left were difficult. Audrey stayed with me for a while, needing space to process what had happened. She cried often, asking how she had missed the signs, how she had trusted someone so completely without seeing the truth beneath the surface. I told her it was not her fault, that Trevor was skilled at deception, that he had fooled all of us. He had been playing a role for years, and he had played it well. Jacob and Mia were angry. Jacob wanted to go after Trevor, to confront him physically, to make him pay for what he had tried to do. But I told him it was not worth it. Trevor was gone, and that was enough. Violence would only make things worse, would only give Trevor ammunition to paint himself as a victim. Mia stayed quiet. Her usual brightness dimmed. She spent hours at my office helping me organize files, as if staying busy would keep the pain at bay. I reached out to Valerie again, asking her to keep monitoring Trevor. I wanted to make sure he stayed away, that he did not try to manipulate Audrey or the kids, that he did not attempt to worm his way back into our lives with apologies and promises. She agreed, saying she would track his movements and let me know if anything changed. About a month later, Valerie called. She said Trevor had moved out of state to Arizona. He had taken a new job, a lower-paying position in sales for a medical supply company, but enough to survive. She said he had not contacted Audrey or the kids, had not tried to fight the divorce. He seemed to be staying away, as we had demanded. But Valerie also found something else. She discovered that Trevor had been in contact with someone before the restaurant incident, a man named Kyle who had a criminal record. Kyle had been arrested twice for fraud, once for identity theft, and once for selling prescription medications without a license. Valerie suspected Trevor had obtained the drug from Kyle, that it was not something he had access to through legitimate means. I asked Valerie to gather evidence, to build a case if needed. She said she would, but warned me that pursuing criminal charges would be complicated. The waiter's photo was not enough on its own, and proving intent would be difficult without a confession or additional testimony. I told her to keep digging anyway. I wanted options, wanted to be prepared if Trevor ever tried to resurface or if he posed a threat to anyone else. Audrey filed for divorce. The process was straightforward since they had no shared assets beyond the house, which was in both their names but heavily mortgaged, and no children together. Trevor did not contest it. The papers were signed within weeks, and Audrey was free. She returned to work, threw herself into her shifts, and slowly started rebuilding her life. She stopped talking about Trevor, stopped mentioning his name. It was as if he had been erased from her history, a chapter she wanted to forget. Jacob and Mia checked in with me often. Jacob asked if I was okay, if I felt safe. I told him I was fine, that Trevor had no reason to come back, that the threat was over. Mia asked if I thought Trevor had ever loved Audrey. I said I did not know, that maybe he had convinced himself he did, that maybe there had been moments of genuine affection, but that his love was conditional, tied to what he thought he could gain. Mia nodded, her expression sad, and we did not speak about it again. I went back to managing the properties, focusing on work to keep my mind occupied. Tenants came and went, leases were renewed, repairs were made. The business ran smoothly, as it always had, but I could not shake the feeling that Trevor was still out there, watching, waiting for an opportunity. Valerie assured me he was keeping his distance, that he seemed more focused on survival than revenge. But I remained cautious, vigilant, unwilling to let my guard down. Then, about 3 months after he left, something happened. I received a letter in the mail, handwritten, no return address. I opened it carefully, my pulse quickening. The letter was from Trevor. He apologized. He said he had been desperate, that the debts had overwhelmed him, that he had made a terrible mistake. He said he never meant to hurt me, that he had just wanted a way out. He asked for forgiveness, said he understood if I could not give it, but hoped I would at least consider it. I read the letter twice, then set it aside. I did not respond. I did not know if the apology was genuine, or if it was another manipulation, another attempt to worm his way back into our lives. Either way, I wanted no part of it. Trevor had shown me who he truly was, and no letter could change that. Valerie called again a few weeks later. She said Trevor had been fired from his new job in Arizona, that he was struggling to find work. She said he had moved again, this time to a cheaper apartment in a rougher part of Phoenix, far from the life he had envisioned for himself. She said his financial situation was worse than before, his debts mounting, his options dwindling. She said he seemed to be spiraling, that his carefully constructed image was falling apart piece by piece. I asked if he posed a threat. Valerie said she did not think so, that Trevor seemed more focused on survival than revenge, more concerned with keeping his head above water than plotting anything against us. But she advised me to stay vigilant, to keep the restraining order we had filed in place, to make sure he knew there would be consequences if he came near us. I agreed, and we ended the call. I thanked her and sat at my desk for a long time, thinking about Trevor, about how quickly his life had unraveled. Part of me felt a grim satisfaction, knowing that his plan had backfired so completely, that the man who had tried to destroy me was now facing his own destruction. But another part of me felt nothing, as if he had become irrelevant, a shadow that no longer had power over us. He was no longer a threat, just a cautionary tale. Audrey started dating again cautiously, with the encouragement of friends. She met a man named Gregory, a teacher who worked at the same hospital in their wellness program, running stress management workshops for nurses and staff. He was kind, patient, and had no interest in my money or my business. He worked because he loved helping people, not because he needed to climb any ladder. Audrey seemed lighter around him, more like herself, more like the woman she had been before Trevor. I met him once over coffee and approved. He was genuine, the opposite of Trevor in every way that mattered. Jacob graduated and came to work with me, just as he had always planned. He learned quickly, asking good questions, treating the tenants with respect, understanding that relationships were just as important as revenue. He talked about expanding the business someday, about buying more properties, about building something even bigger than what I had started. I encouraged him, told him the business was his to shape, that I trusted his judgment completely. He had vision, and he had integrity, two things Trevor had never possessed. Mia finished her degree and started her own design business, working from home, creating logos, websites, marketing materials for small companies around Tulsa. She was talented, creative, and independent, building something entirely her own. She stopped by my office often, bringing coffee and sitting with me while she worked on her laptop, her presence a quiet comfort. I enjoyed her company, the easy silence we shared, the understanding that did not need words. Life settled into a new rhythm. The betrayal was behind us, the wound slowly healing, the family stronger for having survived it. But I knew Trevor's shadow would linger for a long time, a reminder of how trust could be weaponized, how greed could poison even the closest relationships. I had learned to be more careful, more cautious, more aware of the warning signs I had once ignored. I updated my will one more time, adding provisions to protect the estate from anyone who might try to exploit it in the future. I made sure Audrey, Jacob, and Mia were secure, that the business would stay in the family no matter what happened, no matter who might try to interfere. I did not mention Trevor's name in the documents. He did not deserve even that acknowledgement, even that small footnote in the story of what I had built. One evening I sat on my porch watching the sun set over Tulsa. The sky was orange and pink, the air warm, the city settling into the quiet of dusk. I thought about the years ahead, about the legacy I would leave behind, about the people who would carry it forward. I thought about how close I had come to losing it all, to being removed from the picture by a man who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle, nothing more than a means to an end. But I had survived. I had outsmarted him. I had protected what mattered most. And now, the business, the properties, the family, all of it was safe. Trevor had tried to destroy me, but in the end, he had only destroyed himself. His plan had collapsed under the weight of his own greed, his own desperation, his own miscalculation. I took a sip of water, the glass cool in my hand, and allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. I had won, and Trevor, wherever he was, would have to live with the consequences of what he had tried to do. He would carry that weight for the rest of his life, knowing that he had thrown away a family, a future, a chance at something real, all for money that was never going to be his. 4 months passed. I heard nothing from Trevor, and Valerie confirmed he had stayed in Arizona, living quietly, working odd jobs when he could find them, struggling to make ends meet. Audrey's divorce was finalized, the papers signed, the marriage officially dissolved. She seemed happier, more at peace, more herself. Gregory had become a steady presence in her life, and I appreciated the stability he brought, the way he treated her with genuine care and respect. Jacob was thriving at the business, already negotiating new leases and building relationships with contractors and property managers. He had a natural talent for it, an instinct that could not be taught. Mia's design work was taking off, her client list growing, her reputation spreading through word of mouth. The family was healing, moving forward, building new futures on the foundation I had protected. But I was not done yet. I had exposed Trevor, removed him from our lives, but I wanted to make sure he could never come back, could never threaten us again, could never hurt another family the way he had tried to hurt ours. I needed to ensure that his actions had permanent consequences, that he understood there was no path to redemption, no way to undo what he had done. I consulted with my lawyer again, asking about the possibility of pursuing criminal charges. He reviewed the evidence, the waiter's photo, Valerie's report, the letter Trevor had sent, and the information about Kyle. He said we had enough to build a case, but it would require cooperation from the restaurant, from the waiter, and potentially from Kyle, the man who had supplied the drug. He warned me it would be a lengthy process, that Trevor might fight back, that it could drag on for months or even years. He asked if I was prepared for that, I thought about it for days, weighing the risks and benefits. Part of me wanted to let it go, to move forward without looking back, to focus on the family and the business and the future. But another part of me, the part that had spent 35 years building something from nothing, the part that valued justice and accountability, refused to let Trevor escape without real consequences. He had tried to kill me. He had planned to take everything I had worked for, and he had manipulated my daughter, used her as a tool to get what he wanted. I decided to move forward. I authorized my lawyer to file a police report, to gather statements from the waiter and Valerie, and to pursue charges. The process began slowly, with interviews and depositions, but it gained momentum as more evidence came to light. The waiter testified, describing what he had seen at the restaurant, explaining why he had warned me, why he had switched the drinks. Valerie provided her findings, documenting Trevor's debts and connections to Kyle, painting a picture of desperation and premeditation. Kyle, facing his own legal troubles for unrelated fraud charges, agreed to cooperate in exchange for leniency. He confirmed that he had sold Trevor a sedative designed to incapacitate someone temporarily, that Trevor had described it as something he needed for a personal matter, that Kyle had not asked questions because he needed the money. Kyle's testimony was damning, providing the final piece of evidence that connected Trevor's intent to action. The case took months to build, but eventually, the district attorney agreed to press charges. Trevor was arrested in Arizona and extradited back to Oklahoma to face trial. Audrey did not attend the proceedings. She said she could not bear to see him again, that she wanted to move on with her life, that she had no interest in watching him face the consequences of his actions. Jacob and Mia stayed away as well, supporting their mother's decision. I attended every hearing, sitting in the back of the courtroom, watching as Trevor's carefully constructed lies were dismantled piece by piece. Trevor's defense argued that he had been under financial stress, that he had made a mistake but had no real intent to harm me. They tried to paint him as a desperate man who had acted out of fear, not malice, but the evidence was overwhelming. The photo, the testimony, Kyle's confession, all of it pointed to premeditation, to a calculated plan to remove me so he could access my estate. The waiter's account was particularly powerful. His description of Trevor's movements at the bar, the way he had concealed the vial, the deliberateness of his actions. The jury listened carefully, their expressions hardening as the evidence mounted. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, they found Trevor guilty of attempted poisoning and conspiracy to commit fraud. The judge sentenced him to 8 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 5. Trevor stood as the sentence was read, his face blank. He did not look at me, did not make eye contact with anyone in the courtroom. He was led away in handcuffs, and I watched him go, feeling a sense of finality I had not expected. It was over. The man who had tried to destroy me was now facing the full weight of his actions. After the trial, I returned to my office and sat in silence. The business was secure. The family was safe. Trevor was locked away, unable to harm anyone, unable to manipulate or deceive or scheme his way into another person's life. I had achieved what I set out to do. But the victory felt quiet, not triumphant, just resolved. I had lost years trusting someone who had never deserved it. I had put my daughter through pain, exposed my grandchildren to a truth they should never have had to learn. But we had survived, and we were stronger for it. Audrey called me that evening. She said she was relieved it was over, that she could finally close that chapter of her life completely. She thanked me for protecting her, for protecting all of us, for seeing through Trevor when she could not. I told her she did not need to thank me, that it was what family did. We talked for a while, about nothing in particular, about plans for the holidays, about Jacob's progress at work, about Mia's latest design project. When we hung up, I felt a little lighter. Jacob stopped by the next day. He sat across from me in my office, his expression serious. He said he had been thinking about Trevor, about how someone could get so lost, so consumed by greed that they would try to harm their own family. I told him it was a lesson, that people revealed their true selves when they thought no one was watching, when they believed they could get away with something. I told him to always trust his instincts, to pay attention to the small things, the inconsistencies, the moments when someone's words did not match their actions. Jacob nodded, absorbing the advice. He said he wanted to make sure the business stayed strong, that he wanted to honor what I had built. I told him the business was already his, that he did not need to prove anything to me, that I had seen his dedication and his integrity. He smiled, and we shook hands, an unspoken understanding passing between us. Mia came by later that week. She brought coffee and a sketchbook filled with new designs. She showed me her work, and I marveled at her talent, at how much she had grown, at the confidence she had developed. She said she was grateful for everything, that she understood now how fragile trust could be, how important it was to protect the people you loved. I told her she was wise beyond her years, that I was proud of who she was becoming. Life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after everything that had happened. I continued managing the properties, meeting with tenants, handling repairs, training Jacob in the details of the business. Mia visited often, filling the office with her energy and creativity. Audrey found happiness with Gregory, and I watched as she rebuilt her life, stronger and more cautious than before, but also more open to genuine connection. Trevor served his time in an Oklahoma state prison, isolated from the family he had tried to exploit. Audrey never visited him, never wrote to him, never acknowledged his existence. His debts caught up with him, creditors seizing what little he had left. When he was eventually released on parole, he moved to a small town in New Mexico, working manual labor jobs and living in a rented room above a convenience store. He lost everything he had schemed to gain, and the life he had envisioned for himself crumbled into nothing. The family moved on without him, stronger and more united than before, the betrayal a scar that had healed into wisdom. I learned that trust, once broken, could never be fully restored, but that the people who truly mattered would always be worth protecting.